All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to the Gunner Technology Livestream, a weekly 10-minute tech talk for non-techies and techies alike. We are only 17 minutes late this week, so falling back a little bit the wrong direction. I'm your host, Darren Merkins. Cody Swan's with me, CEO of Gunner Technology. What's your excuse, Cody?
We were close to what Lou Brown in Major League would have called a winning streak, but we'll have to start over again. It's actually a pretty interesting story. I know we only have 10 minutes, so I'll keep it short. But actually, you should explain it, because the issue was that you couldn't actually sign into your Google account because you're overseas.
Yeah, I'm actually in London. I've been in London for like 2 weeks now, and I think I already have the black lung. So I would recommend London to everyone for a visit. But if you're overseas and you're using a UK SIM card and you have two-step verification set up on, I guess, any account really that's linked up to your American SIM card, you will not be able to receive the two-step verification message unless, which I had done previously with no intention of doing this, if you hook up your, I have an iPhone, if you hook up your Apple ID to your email and your, which this is kind of a workaround for two-step verification. I don't know how this works, but if you hook it up to your email and your mobile phone, you'll actually get messages. You can grab messages from your Apple ID account. So you can receive the verification text if you put your US SIM card back in and hook up to a Wi-Fi network and receive messages from your Apple ID that's hooked up to your US number.
That sounds
so anyways, it took like 15 minutes to figure that out.
That sounds like how we put together these podcasts, actually. So
it's pretty much as simple as that.
It is interesting, though.
Duct tape and glue.
It is interesting, though. It seems like it's been overlooked in the fact that you try to get your verification code texted to you to add more security, but if you're overseas, you can't actually get that text message to put the code.
You can't. You're totally screwed unless you use like an international plan, I guess. But that's so egregiously expensive. It makes no sense.
And what I use, I actually don't use I use MFA, multi-factor but I actually put in
authentication.
I put in the actual Google app. It comes to my Google app. So I actually get a text message. So
I should probably just install the Google app and
my workaround was a little bit shorter than yours.
Save everyone 2 minutes of explanation for the FUBAR way that I got my text message. So anyways, this is the last part of our 4-part series on the history of JavaScript. It's sad, but we're already at the end. Last week we talked about Node.js, which is sort of the game changer in the sense that it brought JavaScript to the server side. And this week we're going to talk about what is seemingly another game changer, although it's on the same side as JavaScript has generally been on, which is the front end. So just to dive right into it, and this is a question I get asked a lot, so maybe it's a good question to start with, but why does the world need React?
So yeah, that's an actually interesting question. So React, to go back 2 episodes, we had kind of the framework wars, and we determined that jQuery was the winner in that framework war. And then in the evolution of JavaScript, we had Node.js becoming a big one, or a big piece of that history, which was kind of the advent of being able to run JavaScript on a remote computer outside of the browser context with the DOM. And so now kind of React is the most popular framework, basically because, to skip over a lot of stuff, we had a second round of framework wars. jQuery was a framework that was basically added on to the existing structure of internet web-based application development. It sat on top of the layers of the cake that or the layers of the house that we've talked about in previous episodes. React, the new framework wars attempted to redefine what that house actually was. They tried to like reinvent a house. And so we have what are called SPAs, and SPA stands for single page application. Again, to the user, there isn't much difference, maybe except for speed. However, the difference is, again, we talked about Ajax and how Ajax makes a request to get data back and render that data, rather than making a whole round trip to the server to render the whole page all over again. Again, the example was a stock ticker. So an SPA takes that notion to a whole other level. And basically everything is requested remote. So you are only sending back unstructured data, the machine readable data. Basically no human readable data goes over the wire. So you're basically requesting machine readable data with JavaScript. JavaScript is giving you that machine readable data, and then you are using JavaScript to build the structure on site and kind of put it together on the client in a human readable format. In this week's blog post, I use the example of in server parlance in the old methodology. Basically, what you're doing is you're having the window built offsite and then delivered to the house and installed on the house. Now with SPAs, you're kind of building the window on site right there for the house, and you're not going anywhere else to get that window.
And give people a sense of what's a good example of a single page application that everyone would be familiar with.
So again, kind of the quintessential one that I used for Ajax was Gmail, and that's the first one that comes to my mind now as an SPA is Gmail. You're not actually loading a whole bunch of different pages on Gmail. It's only one page, and the view of that one page changes dynamically based on the data that you're requesting. I think that's probably the best example. But some other ones, if you ever use Instagram's website, that's an SPA. There's a lot of SPAs out there now.
And you talked about this being a sort of like a second framework war. What are the frameworks that sort of got into the fray? And I guess in your mind, why do you think React sort of won out over those?
Sure. So again, sort of like going back to framework World Framework War One.
Yeah, WW1. Right?
We had about 4 or 5 frameworks that really competed. And it was the same thing in World Framework War Two.
Right.
We kind of started out with Backbone, and we had Ember.
Ember was for a little while.
Right, and Angular were the first 3 that came out, and that later expanded to include Vue and React. And in round 1, it was kind of like we had in Framework World War II, we had the Pacific scene and the European scene.
Right.
Just to beat this analogy all the way to the.
This is going well.
Yeah. So in the European scene,
who's the Winston Churchill of Framework World War II?
I would say that would definitely be Angular because it was full of hot air.
That was the Zeppelin of Framework World War II.
Exactly. So I'll say in the European scene, that's where, because that sort of started first. You have Angular, Backbone, and Ember, and kind of Angular won that scene, that section of the war, and it was later kind of taken over by Google. Google doesn't own it, but they kind of drive it now. Yeah. So at the same time, React was out there in the Pacific scene, kind of building its own kind of way of doing things. And then Angular, which was called Angular.js when it first released, it went from Angular.js 1.x, as they call it, which is the version number of the framework, to Angular 2. And now I think it's like Angular 6 now. Anyway, the problem was Angular was the winner, but there was a lot of cruft involved with Angular JS 1. And so they tried to do away with that cruft to make it more nimble and almost a little bit more React-like. But in doing so, they changed the whole freaking thing. So
was it backwards compatible still, or did it basically make all Angular one sites?
It was basically a rewrite of the code if you wanted to move from Angular JS 1 to Angular 2.
Sort of like Python 3, Python 2 kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of developers were like, screw this, because not only is it a pain to rewrite, but Angular, its main weakness with this learning curve. It's very dense. The learning curve is very long. So they're like, okay, well, let's check out React. React seems a lot more simple. And it is a lot more simple. And so in doing so and checking out React, in sort of the disgust between the perceived slight of having to move from Angular 1 to Angular 2, React kind of overtook Angular, and React is steadily growing and widening that divide. And just as Angular is backed by Google, React was actually invented, taken over. I can't remember now. I don't want to speak.
Probably bought, but we'll look that up and we'll update the blog post with that information.
I think it was invented by Facebook and then they used it on Instagram, or the thing I can't remember is part of their acquisition of Instagram. They got React because React was used to build Instagram. I cannot remember, but it was either invented with Instagram or with Facebook and was since open sourced, and it's the dominant SPA.
So Google ends up with Angular, Facebook ends up with React, and React has sort of won out at this point. So take us through what React is and what React does and why it's sort of become the go-to.
So interestingly enough, I was not a huge fan of React at first. As we talked about with the house analogy, there's kind of 3 layers to it. You have the structure, which is HTML, the look and feel, the paint, the interior design, which is CSS, and then the functional component, which is JavaScript, which kind of opens the doors, turns off the lights, and everything like that. React, and so you had, since the beginning of internet development up until React, kind of this holy grail where you had a separation of responsibility. You had a clean separation of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. React is kind of like, yeah, nah, we don't care about that. Everything is going to be kind of in one pot. It's going to be all JavaScript kind of thing. And so they get away with, they do away with HTML. They have something called JSX. The CSS is actually implemented in JavaScript, and then the JavaScript is obviously JavaScript. So here I am, kind of this old school developer, and be like, no, you're violating everything I've ever learned about web development. I really don't like this. However, once you get involved with it, it's actually a lot easier to manage all of those in the React kind of state of mind. So React is what they call a view framework. And basically all that means is it's a presentation framework. It controls what you see on your screen, whether that be a mobile device or a laptop or a desktop computer. And so the backbone of React is this thing called state, which is a property of immutable development. So everything is held in state. And in order to change the visual aspect of the design or the layout, you change the state of something. So a button goes from being unclicked to clicked. And so the view reacts to that state change. So everything is just a bunch of changes of state. Your bank account goes from being open to closed. And so when the state changes from open to closed, the view of what you're seeing changes depending on that state. So it makes managing the flow of the application much easier.
So to use our house analogy, would this be something like a wall has a state of the paint color of a wall, and it's just saying I'm blue, I'm blue, I'm blue, I'm blue, and then at some point says I'm red?
Yeah,
in charge of turning that wall red.
Right, that's exactly right. So in the analogy of the house, when I keep using a light switch, so like when you switch on the light, or when you flip the switch up, the light comes on. Well, in React parlance, it's more like when the state of the switch changes to on, the light's state changes to on, and you illuminate the bulb kind of thing.
Yep.
So everything is kind of tied to events, and it makes hooking into state changes a lot easier. So
explain hooking into state changes. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly. So in the first way, you flip a switch and a light comes on. It's tied to the light coming on. And so like, let's say you wanted to play music when you flip the switch. Well, you have to go take the switch apart, add in more components, so when the switch is turned on, the music comes on and the light comes on. In React terminology, all you have to do is have this separate musical device that kind of just waits for the state of the switch to go to on. And when it goes to on, the device plays that music.
So it seems like it's a more passive approach where you have stuff watching as opposed to stuff beaming out messages that I've changed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's more of like a listen model than like a push model. Like do this when I do that. It's more like, hey, just listen for this, and whenever it happens, take care of it.
Because when we're talking about jQuery, which is the original framework war, that was really something like you would bind to a certain event and you would trigger certain things to happen. And that was the cool thing about jQuery is you could chain all this stuff together. But now instead of having to chain all this stuff together, something happens and all these things are watching for something to happen. And once something happens and they notice that that happened, they all know to do something themselves.
Right. That's exactly right. And when the event occurs, you pass the data associated with the event down basically an immutable pipeline. And immutable means that data will not change. So that reduces a lot of errors in other frameworks where the data can change. So you can inadvertently say, for example, to use your wall analogy, if you have a listener to say when the color state of the wall changes to red, do this. Well, if it's not immutable, one of the listeners may change the state from color red to color green, either inadvertently or intentionally, not knowing what they were doing, and it breaks everything else. In React, you don't do that. It sends the state data color red down a pipeline, and nothing can change it. So you remove a lot of the potentials for inadvertent errors.
So it seems like talk about sort of the major benefits, because it seems like what we've talked about so far is everything's in one place. You have people who know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript doing everything all at once. You have data integrity, which is a huge thing nowadays because everything is data. What else does React give you beyond that?
The biggest one, and I'll talk about two really quickly. The biggest one for us is React Native, and React Native is just kind of a built on top of React, and it solves a very big problem in our industry, and that is having native phone applications without having to have two separate code bases.
I hear this mobile thing is really taking off. I think it's probably going to be pretty big.
Yeah, I'm going to eventually I'm going to sell all my shares in Radio Shack and move them into mobile devices. So the two major players obviously are the iPhone and Android devices. And iPhone runs the Swift programming language. The Android phones run the Java programming language, and there's not a lot of crossover. So when you build at least on the front end, when you build, let's say when Facebook builds an application or builds their application, they have to build a version in Swift for the iPhone and a version in Java for the Android device. And so whenever they add a new feature, they have to build it twice. They have to build it in Swift, they have to build it in Java. And for smaller teams on compressed deadlines, that's just a non-starter. You kind of have to pick one and go with it. There was options that were web-based. So you could kind of have web frameworks that pretended to be native applications, but they didn't have a lot of the feature set, and they were slower than native applications. React Native is different. It actually uses JavaScript and the React framework to create components, native components for both iOS and Android. So you can write one code base and publish it and publish your application to both an iPhone and an Android device. The kind of second benefit kind of goes along with it's kind of weird because we talked last week about Node being this great thing that allowed us to write JavaScript on the server. But then we kind of got away from that in React because React wasn't sending pre-formed data down the pipeline. It was just sending machine-readable data down the pipeline, which you can do that with any language. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that React has is called React Server. And so you can send pre-rendered React components from a server to the browser. So why would you want to do that? If you've ever used the Facebook application, and judging from the numbers you have, when you first load the application, you'll notice like a bunch of gray bars are kind of like squiggly in as the data is kind of loading. Those are placeholders. So the visual components are there, and the app is requesting data in the background and fills it in. So you sit there and you see gray squiggly lines until the data actually fills in behind the visuals. With React Server, you can send the components down with the data pre-filled, so you don't see those squiggly lines?
So I think we've run a little bit over already. We're at the 18-minute mark now. We might need to change this to a weekly 20-minute tech talk for non-techies and techies alike.
A weekly 20-minute tech talk that starts sometime around 1 o'clock.
Somewhere around there. I think that's a good place to stop, and keep an eye out for the blog post on gunnertech.com, because we'll go over a little bit. We'll go even more in depth on why React is sort of the bee's knees. But that actually does it for our 4-part series on the history of JavaScript. I apologize for coughing and snarfing throughout this entire episode. And stay tuned next week. We're going to start a new 10-part series on a subject to be revealed in the first episode next week. So tune in for that. That'll be next Thursday at 1 o'clock or somewhere thereabouts. And keep an eye out for our podcast. This will be released on our podcast on iTunes, gunnertech.com for the blog. And this will, I think, pretty soon be released as an ebook on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and wherever else you can buy ebooks. So keep an eye out for that too. Cody, thanks a lot for doing this 4-part series, and appreciate you going in depth on all this stuff.
Yeah, man, it's been a blast, and I'll be recovering from post-holiday depression next week, so I'll probably be drunk or something.
Perfect. So we'll see everybody in 2018. Thanks, y'all. Take care.